Hey class, in this video I want to give you a brief overview of our readings from Descartes and begin the transition from Machiavelli to Descartes. It might seem like a strange transition. Machiavelli is very political and moral in his philosophizing, and Descartes' major concern seems to be foundations of knowledge, what can justify the claim to know something, and ultimately the reformulation of scientific theories. So it's hard to see what the continuity is between Machiavelli and Descartes. We know that Descartes read Machiavelli and that he can discuss at least the prince in fairly elaborate detail. But still, the overall nature of their projects seems to be divergent. But what you'll see when we get to the end of the Discourse on the Method is that Descartes' project is in fact similar to Machiavelli's, insofar as it's an attempt to change or transform a traditional institution. So in the same way Machiavelli wants to transform and update and introduce new modes and orders to politics and ethics, Descartes is going to want to introduce new modes and orders to science. So how is he going to do that? He mainly does that in the two books that I had you read selections from, the Meditations on First Philosophy and the Discourse on the Method. And these books are often paired together, and Descartes almost intends it as much, because there are numerous references to the Meditations on First Philosophy in the Discourses. But there is a crucial difference between the two books that's indicated by the title. The Meditations on First Philosophy is, first of all, the Meditations on First Philosophy are meditations. Descartes envisions that his readers will spend a couple weeks or even a month working out the different sections of the meditations, almost as if you were on a philosophical retreat. The Discourse on the Method is a discourse. It's an essay. It's supposed to be short and punchy and something that you can read fairly quickly and easily. And this is even reflected in the languages that he uses to write them in. He writes the Meditations on First Philosophy in Latin, and he writes the Discourse on the Method in French. French is the sort of the popular language of ordinary people in France, while Latin is like the more scholarly language at the time. And the Meditations on First Philosophy was written to appeal to scholars and theologians and churchmen. If you look at the dedication, it's dedicated to the theology faculty of the Sorbonne, which was like the major university in France at the time. The phrase first philosophy in Descartes' context has a very specific meaning. We would call it roughly metaphysics. What the Meditations on First Philosophy is ultimately about is, what is being? What does it mean to be, and how can I know it? The Discourse on the Method, on the other hand, will only touch upon those questions as necessary, and will instead focus its attention on a reformation of science. We haven't spent a lot of time reading Aristotle. The way science was taught to Descartes, the way science was done in Descartes' time, was heavily influenced by Aristotle. And Descartes is wanting to overturn that. Now, there had been some predecessors, like some people who were already pushing in that direction. Copernicus was a more Platonist in his views of science than Galileo, whose work Descartes was familiar with. Those people like Galileo and Copernicus, Descartes felt did not provide the deepest philosophical justification of a transformation of scientific practice, because they didn't challenge Aristotle's theory of being, of what it means to be. And as long as they don't do that, Descartes thinks they won't ultimately be able to transform science. So this is how the Meditations, this meditation on first philosophy, on what it means to be, is going to dovetail into his Discourse on the Method on how we should actually proceed scientifically. That's a lot. Let's talk a little bit about the Meditations. The Meditations are written in the first person, I. It's easy to think that when we read that Descartes means I, René Descartes. But that's not exactly what he means. A lot of times scholarship will refer to this I that appears in the Meditations as the meditator. Because the idea is that anyone who goes through these meditations can have the same thoughts as Descartes is attributing to the I in the meditations on first philosophy. And so what happens in the first couple meditations? We see Descartes introducing this idea that is almost entirely new in the history of philosophy, which is this idea of radical doubt. We see Descartes wondering, is my whole life a dream? Am I being deceived by an evil demon? Do my senses deceive me? Do my memories deceive me? What can I possibly know? The point of this radical doubt, this radical skepticism, is not to just stay there, right? It's not to just knock everything over and leave it that way. Descartes' goal is that by doubting everything that he can possibly doubt, he hopes to find something that it is impossible for him to doubt. Right? He hopes to find something that is indubitable and absolutely 100% certain. When he goes through all these doubts, what he realizes is that there's one thing that he cannot doubt. And that is that he is the one that's doubting. When I ask myself, hey, am I hallucinating? That allows me to doubt all the things I see around me, but I can't doubt that I am the one that seems to be seeing these things, or I am the one that seems to be hallucinating. I can't doubt that I'm the one that's having these wonders, that I'm the one that this may or may not be happening to. And so what Descartes hits upon in the meditations is his first principle. And his first principle is that I, no matter what else, exist, because I'm the one having all these doubts. But how do I know that I exist? Because I'm doubting. So he hits it on an important principle. The first way you could articulate this principle is that I doubt, therefore I exist. But Descartes' going to broaden it when he sort of sloganizes it, because he realizes that doubting is just one form of a broader activity known as thinking. So Descartes will say, I think, therefore I am. In the Latin, it's cogito ergo sum, right? That because I know that I am thinking, because I know I have thoughts, I know that I exist. I don't know whether or not my thoughts are true, right? My thoughts could be completely hallucinations. I could be wrong about everything. But the one thing I can't be wrong about is that I exist. And so for Descartes, the first principle of philosophy, the first thing that we can know, the thing that's going to be the basis of everything else, is I think, therefore I am. It's important to understand what that means. So I think. That's what I know. I don't know if the contents of my thoughts are true. I think that I'm holding a little leaf in my hand. So I know that I'm thinking that I'm holding a little leaf, but I don't know if I actually have a little leaf, right? Because I could be hallucinating. There could be no leaf. There could be no hand. All I know is that I think that I have a leaf and that I have a hand. The big project for Descartes' metaphysics in the Meditations on First Philosophy is going to be, how can I get from merely knowing my existence and that I have thoughts to knowing whether or not my thoughts are true or false? How can I tell what is real and what's an illusion? So hold that thought from the meditation. So I want to go now over to the discourses. So the discourses on method, like I said, are written in French. They're much more chatty. They're much more charming. They're much easier to read. That said, it is still a fundamentally important work of philosophy. Don't let how charming Descartes is in that fool you. So in the discourses on the method, he's essentially going to advance the same kind of argument, but again, in a much more interesting way. So he talks about his education. So Descartes complains in that he doesn't feel like he's very certain of anything. And he tries to figure out why it is that he doesn't know much. Descartes begins to give us the history of his education. And Descartes went to the finest schools in France, and he was the best student at these schools. And in these schools, they taught him Greek and Latin and history and philosophy and theology, rhetoric and logic and math. He says when he graduated, he felt like he hadn't really learned anything. Now, it's not because he wasn't a good student, because I just said Descartes was one of the best students. And it's not because he didn't go to a good school. He went to the best school in France. And it's not because, like, yes, it was the best school in France, but France didn't have very good schools. France had great schools at the time. So Descartes says, why is it that I didn't learn anything? The answer had to do with the method that was underlying everything that he was taught. Because the method of all the sciences and disciplines that he studied in school was wrong, he wasn't able to learn anything certain. He goes through a couple different examples, but I'll focus on his criticisms of philosophy. So when he was in school, like you, he had to study philosophy. He makes the observations that from the time of Plato to the time of Descartes, no philosopher has agreed with another philosopher about anything. This philosopher says yes, this philosopher says no. He says there's no agreement. In thousands of years of philosophy, philosophers have not settled on a single thing that they can point to and say, yes, this is something philosophy figured out. Is it because these people are idiots? No. It's because they don't have the right method. You could be the smartest person on earth, but if you don't have the right method, you're never going to get to your goal. And as Descartes develops this criticism of the history of philosophy as just this like sequence of unending disagreements leading nowhere, he notices that math is quite different. That mathematicians don't have these kinds of arguments, right? There might be things at the cutting edges of math where mathematicians disagree about whether or not, this new theory works. But by and large, over the history of math, there's agreement. There's not anyone out there being like, no, man, 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2, it equals 11. Like, there's basic agreement in math. Descartes reckons that means that math must have a better method for doing what it does than philosophy, because math is able to produce agreement. And why does math produce agreement? Because it provides convincing proofs, which philosophy does not. Unfortunately, all of the sciences that Descartes was taught were sort of governed by philosophy. Like I mentioned Aristotle earlier. When Descartes learned physics, he learned physics as taught by Aristotle. When he learned biology, it was Aristotelian biology. So you can see the problem. Philosophy can't produce certainty, does not provide convincing proofs, but somehow it gets in the position of telling physics, biology, meteorology, and other sciences what to do. Which is why Descartes thinks there hasn't been any progress really in those sciences. But then again, over here is math. Math seems to have got it figured out. Math somehow seems to be able to produce proofs that provide certainty and yield agreement. So his reasoning is, let's figure out what the mathematical method is, and then we can apply it to other disciplines. And this is the method, right? The book is called The Discourse on the Method. This is what he means by the method. It's basically taking the mathematical method and kind of expanding it to apply it to things that aren't obviously mathematical. There are 4 steps to his method. I'm not going to read them to you verbatim. You can do that yourself. I'm just going to abbreviate them and explain them. So the first step of the method is, don't believe something unless you know for certain that it is true. One way of reading this is, we don't jump to conclusions. Don't say that X is Y or A is B unless you know for certain that that is the case. Your default position when you're asking a question or being asked a question should be, I don't know. And there's no shame in saying, I don't know. The rule you have to follow is you don't know until you know it for certain, right? So we get to the next step. Well, how do we know for certain? Well, if I'm asked a question and I say, I don't know because I don't know for certain, the next thing I'm going to do is break up that question into smaller questions. Because most questions are actually sort of complex questions with lots of parts and subparts. So I'm going to break it up into those smaller sections and then try to answer each of those smaller sections separately and build up to an answer to the sort of the big question. Once I've built up to the answer to the big question, the fourth and last thing I do is show my work. I go back and I check and make sure that everything I've done all along is correct. So we have these 4 steps. This, Descartes would claim, is basically inspired by math. Right? If you have a mathematical equation here, right, you don't just try to guess what the answer is. You don't know. So you try to figure it out. How do you figure it out? You break it up into smaller questions, which we've done with the parentheses and brackets. You start from the smaller questions and work your way out to the bigger question. And as you're solving that, you're supposed to be showing your work so that you can check it when you're done. And then when you say the answer is whatever, if anyone asks you why, you can walk them through all the steps that you've made, all the work you've done, and they will either point out your mistake, and then you and that person can correct the answer, or they will agree that you were right the first time. In either case, this method produces agreement. And so Descartes' idea is to take this method and apply it to all the special sciences like physics, biology, but also to philosophy itself. And with that, I'll let you go.